Welcome to the Best Interest Podcast, where we believe Benjamin Franklin's advice that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, both in finances and in your life. Every episode teaches you personal finance and investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Kramer.
Hello and welcome to episode 81 of the Best Interest Podcast. My name is Jesse Kramer. Today is an Ask Me Anything episode. Some of you who are listening only might not realize this, but for the past month or so, in my weekly newsletter, which you can subscribe to for free at bestinterest.blog, in the weekly newsletter, I've been telling my readers, hey, I'm going to start doing Ask Me Anything episodes. So submit your questions, financial planning, personal finance basics, investing, whatever it is. Submit your questions. And every so often, and you'll see the frequency, who knows what the frequency will be in the future, maybe once a quarter, maybe a little more frequent than that. But every so often, I'm going to put out one of these episodes, an Ask Me Anything episode, where I'm going to go through some of your questions live on the podcast and share some answers with you. Before we get to today's questions, though, I'm going to do a customary review of the week from Apple Podcasts. This is a 5-star review from G Kling 50, who said, Jesse took my call, which I did. And G Kling says, after listening to Jesse's podcast about the 5 golden rules, I was interested when he spoke that most of his listeners are DIY people. So I had some personal questions for him. I emailed him and he asked me to call. He spent over 30 minutes with me answering all my questions. He sent me reading materials, as well as he forwarded me names who could further help me. I've heard him say several times on the podcast to reach out to him if you have questions, and I was pleasantly surprised to realize this is true. He is the real deal. Thanks, Jesse. Well, thank you, G Kling. I was happy to help you and take your call. Listeners, if I get inundated with requests for phone calls, I suppose I'll have to change my system. I'm not sure I have enough time to answer everybody's questions via a personal 30-minute phone call, but I do really like answering your questions, hence this AMA episode. So I hope this starts a virtuous cycle and the snowball grows and more of you submit your questions, and then I get to answer more of them here on the Best Interest Podcast. So without further ado, let's dive into today's AMA. Okay, first question from Andrew. Andrew says, hey Jesse, I wanted to shoot you a question for the AMA. I'm about to turn 30 years old. I have roughly $185,000 in retirement accounts and about $30,000 in taxable accounts. Assuming an 8% annual growth rate, my retirement accounts could grow to $2.7 million without any additional contributions. Most would say this is Coast FI. And we'll explain what that is later. With a goal to retire early, I understand the importance of a bridge account. Do you think it's better to give up the better tax treatment in the retirement accounts, knowing I can't access them until I'm age 59 and a half? So giving up those retirement accounts to instead fund the bridge account? Or should Andrew stay the course by maxing out his 401k and Roth IRA first, and then only put remaining money into his taxable accounts? Very good question, Andrew. And actually, I'm going to combine that with a second question, which came from Kenton. Kenton said, good evening, Jesse. I'm about 27. My fiance and I are on track for retirement with our 401ks and Roth IRAs, but we aren't maxing them out. I am hesitant to max them out because I don't want to be quote unquote retirement rich. We already have started a brokerage account for future vehicles. What are your thoughts on increasing the amount to that bucket, the brokerage bucket, instead of retirement accounts in case opportunities arise between now and retirement? Best, Kenton. So both of these questions share a pretty similar tenor, which is we have 2 young people, 30, 27, somewhere in that age range. We have some young adults who are doing a really diligent job saving for the long run. They're utilizing, to some extent, their 401ks, their Roth IRAs, other tax-advantaged retirement accounts. But they have this realization that if all they do is fund retirement accounts, they might be in a situation where all their money can't be easily touched until they're 59 and a half. And if they wanted to retire before then, maybe they should be funding another bucket. Okay, so we're going to dive into some of the details now. First, from Andrew's question, the first question, we're going to talk about what Coast FI is, if you haven't heard of this term. In a nutshell, Coast FI, or Coast Financial Independence, as the name implies, it implies some sort of coasting, right? Taking your foot off the gas and just coasting for a while. And it's this phenomenon that occurs when someone's young, they've saved a lot, and they realize, whoa, I've saved so much that I could essentially never save another dollar. I could depend on investment returns to the things that I already have saved, and my accounts would grow over coming years and decades to a certain point where I'd actually reach most of my financial goals. In theory, you could save so much by age 35, and maybe you live a pretty frugal lifestyle. So you just take your foot off the gas, you let that money grow from age 35 to 55, and by the time you're 55, that money has compounded so much that you could just retire. And in the meantime, if you wanted to, you could say, go from some high stress job that you were working in your early years to save all this money when you were 35, and you could go take your foot off the gas, go to a lower stress job, switch careers altogether. You don't really have to save anymore because you've reached that coast FI point. And so Andrew's saying that he thinks, based on his math, based on the roughly $215,000 he has saved and a reasonable 8% annual growth rate, that he's about coast FI, which great for you, Andrew. Now, Andrew talks about a bridge account, and Kenton, in our second question, also talked about a bridge account, something to that extent. The idea there is, let's say Andrew or Kenton, they want to retire well before age 59 and a half. And we know that traditional accounts, whether it's a 401k or a Roth IRA, they're not supposed to be touched until age 59 and a half. Now, the FIRE movement, the financial independence movement, there is a lot of really good material out there about things like 72T withdrawals, Roth conversion ladders, the rule of 55. All of these concepts that I just described, all those strange terms that I just used, describe a larger concept that allows people to access their retirement money earlier. Usually there's a caveat or an asterisk associated with that, but there are many ways that financially independent people, or people who are hoping to be FIRE, right, financially independent and retire early, there are many ways that those people are actually able to tap into their retirement accounts, 401k, Roth IRA, well before the age of 59 and a half. I'm not going to dive into all of the details right now, Andrew and Kenton, but I recommend you guys look into that. But I want to address the questions a little bit more head on. Now, there are some scenarios for some people where the best advice is fill up your 401k first, fill up your Roth IRA first, full stop. Use those tax advantages as much as you can, and only then, if you have extra money to save, should you utilize a taxable brokerage account. But there are other situations where the best advice is, hey, as soon as you start putting dollars away into long-term investment accounts, you should strike a balance between tax-deferred accounts and traditional 401k and the after-tax Roth IRA, the taxable brokerage. Right from the start, you want to find a balance between these dollars that are in these qualified accounts, can't kind of touch them to 59 and a half, except you sort of can, as I just described. Whereas the taxable account is totally flexible, right? You can put money in today, you can let it grow for the long run, but if you decide to change your mind in a couple years, you can pull the money back out. You might have to pay some capital gains taxes. You might have to pay some taxes on dividends and interest along the way. That is the penalty, if you will, or that's the difference between the qualified account where you have tax-deferred growth, which is fantastic, versus the taxable account where you do not have tax-deferred growth. Now, there are a few general rules that I use for these situations. For example, the first one, the less defined someone's long-term goals are, the more likely I am to encourage them to first take advantage of their tax-advantaged accounts. Now, why? Well, because each year you are allotted a certain amount of tax-advantaged savings. And if you don't use that opportunity in that given year, you lose it. You know, we all know, maybe most of us know, what's the 2024 max out for a 401k, I think is $23,500. $23,500 for an individual W-2 worker. So if you don't fill up that $23,500 bucket in 2024, whatever you don't use, you don't get to make up for it next year. So if someone's goals are relatively undefined and I don't really know much else about them, in other words, if they're kind of saving in a vacuum and we don't know too much about your future plans, I would rather use this year's tax advantages as much as I can rather than lose it. But then there's another side of the coin, another general rule that I use, which is the more defined someone's long-term goals are, the better we can plan out the future, and the more likely I am to recommend taxable savings in concert with tax-advantaged savings. So Kenton, if I know, for example, that you want to retire at age 45, which for you is 18 years away, then I'll know that you'll need some sort of strategy to bridge the gap from age 45 to age 59. That strategy can involve the early withdrawal strategies like a Roth conversion ladder or the 72T, but it should also probably involve you leaning on taxable accounts. So if I know someone's long-term goals really well, then I'm more likely to find a reason for them to start saving money today into that flexible taxable brokerage account. And then there's one more general rule that I use for these kind of situations. More income, the more income someone is earning, the more likely they should be utilizing a taxable account in some way. And there are a few reasons why. First off, it's easier for people with higher incomes to quickly fill up their tax-advantaged buckets. We already talked about $23,500 into a 401k, $7,000 into a Roth IRA. Well, if you're earning $300,000 a year, you should relatively easily be able to fill up those two buckets, and then you still might be saving. And so, boom, the flexible taxable brokerage makes a lot of sense there. But in another way, that was just kind of basic arithmetic. The marginal dollar actually means less to higher earners. So not only is it simple arithmetic from the fact that $1 is just a lower percentage of income if you're earning that much money, but actually Danny Kahneman's behavioral research supports that idea too, that the 1,000th first dollar we earn is far less meaningful than the first dollar we earn. The millionth dollar we earn is far less meaningful than the 1,000th dollar we earn. And there's a reason when you go into a small business, a small restaurant, there's a reason that they frame the first dollar that they ever earned up on the wall. It's because that dollar is really important to them. And the millionth dollar you earn simply isn't that important anymore. So for higher earners, I'm a bit less concerned about optimizing each and every dollar in their financial ecosystem. And I'm more concerned about giving them flexibility. So essentially, this whole conversation that we're having, whether to use these qualified retirement accounts like a 401k or a Roth IRA or not, that whole conversation is about a trade-off between total assets and tax savings and flexibility. Now, when you earn less and when I don't know as much about your future goals, I want to focus more on total assets and tax savings. But as you earn more and more, or as I'm more aware of your total financial ecosystem, that's where I start to recommend focusing more on time flexibility. And maybe we don't have to optimize each and every dollar if instead we can gain more time. So Kenton and Andrew, I hope that answered your question, guys. Thank you for writing in. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. A few of you occasionally inquire about two different topics that are actually related. The first type of question seeks out details about my professional life and the wealth management firm that I work for here in Rochester, New York. The second type of question involves the best interest, which operates with no advertising, no pushy sales, no paywalls. And the question is, how can the best interest stay afloat? Well, to answer both of those questions, I want to point you to episode 78 of the Best Interest podcast. I intentionally recorded episode 78 to shine light on those topics and inform you how you can actually help the best interest if you're so inclined. So if you've ever been curious about the business of the best interest, please go listen or download episode 78 and let me know what you think. Question number 2 comes from Justin. Justin writes in and says, as a soon-to-be dad, which is true, not exactly sure when this episode will publish, but if you're listening to it after June, most likely I am a dad by that point. So the question is, as a soon-to-be dad, Jesse, is there a personal finance topics, for example, 529 accounts, that you've really been learning more about recently? Also, are there any financial to-do items that you're choosing to cross off now? I'm curious to hear how becoming a parent is changing how you're managing your money. Yeah, Justin, absolutely. Terrific question. I'm going to answer, it's a kind of a two-parter question, but I'm going to answer it all at once. There are some financial to-do items that we've been crossing off ahead of time. In fact, going into this year, we earmarked a pretty significant amount of our emergency fund, or just our savings, our cash, if you will, for the birth itself, because we're not on a platinum Cadillac health plan. And so a good amount of the birthing costs are actually coming out of pocket, and birth is a very expensive thing. But also just there are all these ancillary baby costs, as anyone with a baby can probably attest to. There's the crib, and there's clothing, and there's diapers, and there's bottles, and there's just accessories galore. There's just so many little things, car seats, bassinets, and just anyone, I think many parents can relate to this, and all this stuff's pretty expensive, right? I don't know if there's a baby premium in the same way that there's a wedding premium. There's just so much baby stuff that it's pretty expensive. So Kelly and I intentionally going into this year, we looked at our total cash savings, as I think all of us should be doing on a fairly regular basis. You should be looking at your total cash savings and understanding what's the purpose of those dollars there. Certain of those dollars are there purely as an emergency fund. Some of those dollars might be there because you're planning on buying a car in the next 12 months and it just makes sense to hold them in cash until you buy that car. Well, for us, because we knew this baby was coming around June, we earmarked a certain number of dollars specifically for those baby costs. That said, probably the biggest topic, at least in my opinion, the biggest topic that I've been thinking about is household cash flow. For example, will we be using childcare, daycare? Will Kelly go part-time to work? Either way, if we go down either of those paths, we're talking about either significantly higher monthly expenses with childcare, or we're talking about significantly lower household income if one of us goes part-time to work. We're either going to be earning less or spending more, maybe even both. And so understanding how your monthly cash flow is changing, how our monthly cash flow is changing, understanding that potentially for a short period of time, or depending what, we have different options. Maybe we can actually operate at a monthly loss for a short period of time because we have the cash buffer behind us to make up for that loss. Or perhaps we tighten the belt in a couple of areas just to make sure that we're operating at a net neutral on a monthly basis because we know that some of that cash flow is going to be changing. So I think that's probably the biggest topic on my mind, at least. And Kelly and I, we do a quarterly financial review together. I think that's something that most families or most partners should do. Maybe it doesn't have to be quarterly. Maybe it's once a year. Maybe it's every 6 months. But it's important to be on the same page financially with your partners. And this is going to be no different. So when the baby's in that first 3-6 months of the baby being around, we're going to be paying attention and just seeing how are our finances changing? How's our net worth statement, our balance sheet changing? And do we need to rethink our future child raising techniques? Because, is our monthly cash flow healthy enough to support what we hope to do there? A couple other things that I think I'm thinking about that most parents should be thinking about. I think most parents should be thinking about it. Insurance needs. So especially assuming we do go down to 1 paycheck or 1.5 paychecks, that could place an even greater insurance need on our family. Life insurance, that is, right? We're talking about term life insurance here. Because now all of a sudden we have a mortgage to pay off. And we also have 18 to 22 years of child-related household outflows. If I got hit by a bus tomorrow, I would want to make sure that Kelly and the child were in a good place. So insurance needs, that's a big one. And that leads into just the kind of the general estate planning, guardianship. Guardianship really is coming up for the first time. Estate planning is more serious than ever when you have a child in your family. Again, depending on when this episode comes out, I'm recording an episode with Andy Hill of Marriage, Kids, and Money fame. And Marriage, Kids, and Money, if you haven't heard of it, is a terrific financial podcast about marriage, kids, and money. And Andy and I are going to go deep on a lot of the financial topics that new parents face. So great question, Justin. I hope that was a good answer for you. Next question comes from G. G says, I'm close to 100% large cap stocks in my portfolio, and it's worked great for me for quite a few years now. As time has gone by, I have sold more and more of my small cap, my mid cap, my international, and I've gone all in on large cap stocks, and it's working. It's hard for me to see why this isn't a good strategy going forward. I'm close to retirement, but why should I change? So G, thanks for the question. Since you and I went back and forth via email about this, and I know a little bit about you, G, I'm going to use a unique Western New York analogy as part of my answer. So imagine I replaced the words large cap stocks in your question with Kodak. And let's say it's 1985. So you're a person in 1985 and you say, I'm close in my portfolio to being 100% in Kodak stock. And it's worked great for me for quite a few years now. As time has gone by, I've sold more and more of my other companies, my small mid cap, my international companies, my international stocks, and I've gone all in on Kodak. And it's working. It's hard for me to see why this isn't a good strategy going forward. Now, my example sounds a little bit crazy, I know, because we're smart investors here. We would never go 100% into one single company. And of course, I've intentionally cherry-picked a company that we all know went bankrupt. But some of the underlying principles of why that Kodak statement is kind of crazy should ring true for your portfolio, G. Maybe not to the same degree, but the same underlying principles are there. You are going further and further into one single asset class, large cap stocks. So there are no bonds in your portfolio despite approaching retirement. Granted, I know as we discussed, G, and the listeners don't know this, G will be receiving a pension of some sort. And it's worth knowing that a pension serves as fixed income, which should lessen G's need for any bonds in their portfolio. But it's worth a second look to understand. I mean, you have no other diversifying assets outside of large cap stocks. You're all in on the US. There's no geographic diversification. There's no international stocks, for example. If you look at market history and when you look at what someone might consider a diversified or balanced portfolio, a lot of times you're going to see something along the lines of a 70-30 portfolio in the stock portion, meaning 70% US stocks, 30% international stocks, maybe 65-35, maybe even 60-40, 60% US stocks, 40% international stocks. And one of the reasons why is because when you zoom out, which we need to do here, when you zoom out over market history, you would see that the best risk-adjusted returns come from that mix of US and international stocks, somewhere between 60-40 and 70-30. Another thing, G, is that you're all in large cap stocks, no small caps, no medium-sized companies, just the few hundred biggest US companies and nothing else. Now, it's far, far, far from the worst asset allocation I've ever seen, but I do really think it needs some polishing, some pretty important polishing. We cannot and we should not say that the recent past has been this one specific way, and therefore I'm going to assume that the future will be that exact same way. Or using specifics here, the recent past has been most beneficial for investors in 100% large cap stocks, and therefore the future will also be most beneficial for investors in large cap stocks. It could be that way, but I highly, highly doubt it. And I don't only doubt it because it's not like there's some randomization here that it's like, oh, you rolled double sixes now, and what are the odds you roll double sixes again? That's not it at all. And yes, we do need to accept that fact that we can't predict the future. And we need to accept that fact, especially in investing, that the past does not dictate the future. But there's something even more important, G, and I want to impart John Bogle's famous, what he calls the iron rule of investing. And the iron rule of investing is reversion to the mean. Reversion to the mean meaning average. Reversion meaning in time, all things tend to track back to the average in investing. No asset class can outperform forever. That's a big part of what John Bogle was saying. Asset classes, they could outperform for a year, for a few years, maybe even for a decade. But the asset classes that tend to outperform for a decade, well, they tend to underperform the next decade. And in the long run, an asset class that has a similar risk profile to one another, so say domestic stocks and international stocks, they're both equities, they have a relatively similar risk profile to one another, they will tend to have a similar reward profile to one another in the long run. Meaning when their reward profiles fall out of sync for a certain period of time, eventually they will likely revert. And we're coming off a period, to G's defense, from 2009 to basically today, May of 2024, where US stocks have been crushing international stocks, specifically US large cap stocks. The S&P 500 has been one of, if not the best performing equity asset classes for the last 15 years. And that's terrific. But what John Bogle has preached to us, and John Bogle's not the only one. I mean, most people who talk about diversification would agree with this idea. The idea is that nothing can outperform forever. I think I used that term before. And the fact that large cap stocks have been so good for the past 15 years, I don't think we should abandon them altogether because we can't predict the future. But it also doesn't mean that we should put all of our chips into large cap stocks. In fact, if anything, it might be time to dial down that risk. Diversification is the way. We don't know what the best performing asset classes are going to be in the next 6 months, the next 6 years, the next 60 years. We're not exactly sure. But eventually, all asset classes revert back to the mean. At least they have so far in history. Again, hard to tell what the future will hold. But this is where some basic financial planning comes into play for G. Now, I would start, G, by developing your net worth statement. Maybe you've already done that. And a 10-year projected cash flow. Maybe you've already done that. That cash flow would, if I were looking at it, it would help me understand what your outbound cash needs are from your portfolio in the short term, the next couple of years, the medium term, and eventually in the long term. And I'd want to understand questions about what you want to do with your money over the rest of your life, and even what you hope to do with your money after you pass away. Now, all of those types of input would then allow us to back into a more appropriate asset class for you. It might involve different asset classes of equities, right? Diversifying into different mid-cap, small-cap, international, those kind of things. It might involve some bonds for some fixed income. It might involve some alternatives, real estate, whatever it may be. Without knowing too much more of your story, G, I am pretty hesitant to suggest something like 100% large cap S&P 500 stocks. I understand how well it has worked for you for the past 15 years, or however long that's been your portfolio design. And one of the most challenging things in investing is this thought process that occurs when something goes really, really well for us in investing and we go, oh, we figured it out. Let's put more of our chips into that specific bet. Oh, amazing. The S&P 500 has done so well for me. I'm going to put more there and more there and more there. And if there's anything we can learn from investing history, from market history, from the wisest people involved in investing, that can be a dangerous game. Warren Buffett's pretty good at it. Warren Buffett is very famous for saying, when you find a good investment, you go all in. But what Warren Buffett is doing, the way that he's able to analyze and understand the models of specific businesses, right? Warren Buffett's very much a person who invests in specific businesses, and his analysis techniques and his patience and his mindset, his temperament is what makes him really unique. He's not the only one, right? There are many individual investors out there who have found great success with similar tactics. No offense to anybody out there listening. One thing that those investors aren't doing is writing in DIY emails to a podcast saying, hey, I've got all my chips on this bet. Tell me why I'm wrong. The idea is, if you're here listening, if you're like me, which is you're kind of a DIYer, maybe you've got that little extra expertise, diversification is your friend. It reduces the range of potential outcomes that you have. And that's really big when it comes to financial planning. If you've already won the game, so to speak, if you've put yourself in this great position in terms of your asset size as you go into retirement, and all you want to do is live that successful retirement, and you don't have to worry too much about whether your portfolio is way up or way down, you need to reduce your range of potential outcomes. And the way you do that is through diversification. The S&P 500, and maybe this will be my last point because I know I'm kind of beating it to death, but the S&P 500 is very capable of losing 20 to 40% over a couple years. It's also very capable of going up 20 to 40% over a couple years. But one thing I would hate to see happen to you, G, is to see this sudden shocking reversion to the mean over the next 6 or 12 or 18 months, where the S&P 500 essentially starts to underperform the rest of the world, or stocks drastically underperform bonds, and you're sitting there 100% into the S&P 500, and maybe you lose 30% of your net worth over the next 18 months. If you hold for the long run, maybe most of that 30% drop will recover, but it's going to be pretty hard mentally to live through that. And it's going to be pretty hard mentally to live through that knowing that you could have been in a little bit more of a balanced place. So anyway, that is the argument, or that's one of many arguments for a little bit of diversification, a little bit of balance, remembering John Bogle's lesson of reversion to the mean. G, since I know that we've had a conversation before, by all means, feel free to reach out to me and we can discuss it again. But I hope that answer helps you think about what you should be doing moving forward. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Every week, I send a quick free email to thousands of readers that shares 3 simple things. 1, my new articles and podcasts. 2, the best financial content of the week from all over the internet. And 3, a financial chart that explains some important concept in the news that week. It's a great primer to boost your financial know-how.
But Jesse, I don't want another email.
Well, this might not be for you, but I do hear you, which is why I make it very short, sweet, and full of only the essentials. A whopping 66% of subscribers read my email at least once a month. They're enjoying it, and maybe you will too. You can subscribe for free on the homepage at bestinterest.blog. Again, that's a free, no-strings-attached subscription at bestinterest.blog. The next question comes in from Whitney. Whitney says, hey Jesse, my husband's employer offers both a traditional 401k and a Roth 401k with a 6% match. He is interested in contributing to both accounts for tax diversification. We are currently 30 years old, but we plan to retire before 55, so we have another early retirement question. Now, a Roth IRA, so not the 401ks, you listeners, but a Roth IRA seems more flexible since we can access contributions without penalty before age 59 and a half. But then he misses out on his 401k match. If Whitney's husband contributes directly to an IRA, there's no employer match in an IRA. So Whitney's question is, can a Roth 401k be rolled over to a Roth IRA without separating from the employer? Is that something that could be done, say, once a year? Thank you for all your hard work. Well, you're welcome, Whitney. Thank you for your question. We're going to answer a few different embedded questions within your question, Whitney, but I'm going to start directly with what you asked me, which is, can a Roth 401k be rolled over to a Roth IRA without separating from the employer? So some of you listening might know this, some of you might not know this, but typically in most 401k plans, but not all 401k plans, the only way to roll over a 401k to an IRA is if the employee, in this case, Whitney's husband, is no longer working with the employer to whom the 401k is attached. So I've shared with you before, right? I was an aerospace engineer at L3 Harris, which is a very large engineering firm, national engineering firm. And the question is, if L3 Harris has a typical 401k, then the only way I could roll that 401k money over into an IRA was after I left the company, L3 Harris. As long as I was an employee there, the 401k had to stay there. And now that rule, that idea that your 401k has to stay with the employer inside the 401k plan as long as you're an employee, that specifically is written into each employer's individual, unique 401k plan. Now, some employers, though, they have a different rule or a different set of rules written into their 401k plan that allows something called an in-service rollover. And as the name might imply, as you might be able to guess, what that permits is that while you're still in service at your employer, while you're still working, you can actually do rollovers to IRAs. This is very interesting for a number of reasons. For one, it allows something called the mega backdoor IRA. I won't go into too much detail there, but essentially it allows you to put away a lot of money every year into a backdoor IRA, into a backdoor Roth IRA. So that's worth understanding. Especially if you're a high earner, you might want to look up that mega backdoor Roth IRA, or we can talk about it another time. But more specific to Whitney's question, Whitney, I would have your husband reach out to his employer. And for any of you listening, if this is something you're interested in, you can reach out to your employer and you can ask them, hey, am I allowed to do an in-service rollover from my 401k plan? If yes, that's a pretty good thing. And it might open up some financial planning doors for you that previously you thought closed. Now, I want to go to another part of Whitney's question though, which is the traditional 401k versus the Roth 401k, a matching fund from the employer in either case, and the husband being interested, Whitney's husband, I should say, being interested in contributing to both accounts for tax diversification. Now, tax diversification is certainly a smart thing. It's something that I do personally. I contribute as much as I can to my traditional 401k, and then I also contribute to a Roth IRA, well, as long as I can, because as you might know, there are some income limits to contributing to a Roth IRA. Either way, I kind of want to have money in both pots, traditional and Roth. And the reason why, of course, is because in retirement, we don't know exactly what the tax code will look like in that future time. And it's good to have some tax-free assets, some tax-deferred assets, and also some taxable assets, some assets in a taxable brokerage account, because it allows us to play some games in any individual year, depending on what the federal tax code looks like. So-and-so gets elected president, taxes go up. So-and-so gets elected president, taxes don't go down. Depending on the tax scenario, you might say, I'm going to pull extra from my traditional account this year. Tax rates are pretty low, and I don't mind paying low income tax over these years. So I'm going to pull on my traditional accounts versus other years you say, ooh, tax rates are pretty high. I'm going to pull on my Roth accounts because it's tax-free anyway. So I'm just going to avoid those high tax rates altogether. So it is smart what you're talking about, Whitney, or at least the logic is very sound. But I'm going to point out one potential thing for you and your husband to think about, Whitney, or listeners for you to think about. And that is, what is your tax rate right now? Your total household tax rate right now versus what do you think your tax rate will look like when you retire? Whitney, you and your husband, you're 30 right now. You plan to retire before you're 55. Ostensibly, there are going to be some years in your early retirement when you're not collecting Social Security, you're no longer collecting W-2 income. Your total income is going to be pretty low. Maybe your only income those years is going to be withdrawals from, say, a 72T or a Roth conversions. Those are going to be the only way that you're realizing income in those years. And your future income tax rate in those years is going to be pretty low. Whereas maybe right now, Whitney, maybe you and your husband are earning a great living, and maybe you're actually in a pretty high federal income tax bracket right now. Maybe you're in the 35% tax bracket right now, Whitney. But in those early years of retirement, you're only going to be in the 12% tax bracket. So my question to you would be, since you have that difference in tax brackets, 35% today, 12% in the future, might it make sense for you to maximize your traditional accounts right now to save 35 cents on the dollar right now, knowing that in the future, you're only going to have to pay 12 cents on the dollar in tax? That might make sense. By splitting between traditional and Roth right now, in that hypothetical scenario that I just painted for you, and your traditional dollars, you're saving 35 cents on the dollar. But in those Roth dollars, you're choosing to pay 35 cents of tax on the dollar that you might be able to save. And in retirement, sure, you're going to be able to pull on those Roth dollars tax-free, but you already paid the 35 cents on the dollar today. So anyway, it's just something maybe you and your husband have already thought about it, Whitney. But for those listeners who are considering some sort of tax diversification strategy in their own portfolio, it is worth understanding why are you doing it in the first place? And it's worth understanding, right? What's your tax rate today? What might your tax rate be in the future? And this is just a big part of tax planning in general. Are there going to be specific years in the future when you can likely pay much lower tax rates and thus realize taxes at that future time instead of realizing taxes today? We've talked about Roth conversions on the show before, and we've written about Roth conversions a lot on the blog. And that's all Roth conversions are. The whole Roth conversion logic is, can I realize some taxes today at a low tax rate, convert those dollars to Roth, and then avoid paying higher tax rates later, especially when we get to something like RMD, required minimum distribution age. So Whitney, I know that was a lot. That was some food for thought. The upshot, the summary is your husband should ask his employer, he should ask HR, or maybe they might just point him straight to the 401k administrator if he's allowed to do in-service rollovers. It's worth knowing. Either way, even if he is allowed to do in-service rollovers, it's worth asking yourselves how well you understand your current and your future tax rates and whether it's worth contributing to that Roth 401k today in the first place. Andrew and Kenton and Justin and G and Whitney, thank you guys so much for those terrific questions. Please, listeners, keep them coming. If you enjoyed this AMA episode, please shoot me an email, jesse@bestinterest.blog. Let me know, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Let me know. And please send me questions for future AMAs. As long as you guys enjoy this, I'm going to make this a regular cadence on the show, some fun AMA episodes. I find it pretty enjoyable to think about and answer your questions. And so this is a win-win. What do they say? Rising tide lifts all ships, and we are investing in knowledge together. So thank you all for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Best Interest Podcast. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email at jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves, and we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of the Best Interest Podcast. The Best Interest Podcast is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice and is not prescriptive of your financial situation.